A prison bully ruled with fear, believing no one could touch him. Every day, Marcus Reynolds made life hell for the weakest inmates, especially in the blind spots where cameras couldn't reach. He thought he was untouchable. He thought wrong. Because someone had been documenting everything, every threat, every attack, every moment of cruelty. And when the truth finally came to light, it would shake the entire facility to its core. This is a story about justice, courage, and the power of one person who refused to look away. Get ready for a journey that will restore your faith in doing what's right, even when it seems impossible. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The King of Cell Block D. Marcus Reynolds had been in Riverside State Penitentiary for 3 years, and in that time, he'd built an empire of fear at 6'4" and 240 pounds of solid muscle. He was an intimidating presence in any room. But it wasn't just his size that made him dangerous. It was his intelligence, his cunning, and his complete lack of empathy. Cell Block D was his kingdom, and everyone knew it. The correctional officers knew it too, though they'd never admit it publicly. Marcus had a way of operating just below the radar, always careful, always calculating. He knew where every camera was positioned. He knew the blind spots, the corners where surveillance didn't reach, the moments when guards were distracted during shift changes. His latest target was a man named David Chen, a 42-year-old former accountant serving 5 years for white-collar crimes. David was everything Marcus despised: educated, soft-spoken, physically weak. He'd arrived at Riverside 3 months ago, and Marcus had marked him immediately. It started small. A shoulder check in the corridor. Food knocked off David's tray in the cafeteria. Whispered threats in passing. But it escalated quickly. Marcus had a talent for psychological warfare, breaking men down piece by piece until they were shells of themselves. David tried to report it once, approaching Officer Williams during rec time. But without evidence, without witnesses willing to speak up, there was nothing the administration could do. Everyone knew what happened to snitches in Cell Block D. The unspoken rule was simple: keep your head down, do your time, and don't make waves. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that someone was watching. Not through the official cameras, not through the sanctioned surveillance system, but through a pair of eyes that saw everything. Someone who was tired of the injustice, tired of watching good people suffer while predators like Marcus operated with impunity. Thomas Wright had been a correctional officer at Riverside for 15 years. He'd seen it all: riots, escapes, deaths. But what bothered him most wasn't the dramatic incidents that made the news. It was the quiet cruelty, the daily degradation that inmates like David endured while the system looked the other way. Thomas had noticed Marcus from day one. He'd watched the man's pattern, studied his methods, and recognized him for what he was: a predator who'd perfected his craft. And Thomas had made a decision that could cost him his career, maybe even his freedom. He'd started documenting everything, using his personal phone during off hours, staying late after shifts. Thomas began building a case. He photographed bruises on David's arms during medical checks. He recorded conversations in areas where he was legally allowed to do so. He documented patterns of movement, correlations between Marcus's location and incidents of violence or theft. It was dangerous work. If Marcus discovered what he was doing, Thomas knew his life would be in danger. If the administration found out, he'd be fired for violating protocol. But Thomas had a daughter, Emma, who was David's age. Every time he looked at David's frightened face, he saw her, and he couldn't stand by and do nothing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Thomas was finishing his shift when he heard commotion near the showers, an area he knew had a camera blind spot. His instincts screamed at him to investigate, but protocol said he should call for backup first. He did both. What he found would change everything. The shower incident. The showers in Cell Block D were the worst maintained area of the entire facility. Built in the 1970s, they featured rusted fixtures, cracked tiles, and a drainage system that barely functioned. More importantly, they had exactly 3 security cameras, each positioned to cover the entrance and main walkway. But the back row of shower stalls? Complete blind spot. Marcus Reynolds knew this better than anyone. That Tuesday evening, he'd orchestrated everything perfectly. He'd convinced his cellmate, a loyal follower named James Razor Morrison, to create a distraction near the rec room. He'd waited until the 6 o'clock shift change, when guards were preoccupied with handoff procedures, and he'd cornered David Chen in the last shower stall, where no camera could see them. "You've been avoiding me, Chen," Marcus said, blocking the only exit. His voice was calm, almost friendly, which somehow made it more terrifying. "That hurts my feelings. I thought we were becoming friends." David's hands trembled as he clutched his towel. Water from the shower behind him was still running, creating a constant white noise that would mask any sounds of struggle. "I don't want any trouble, Marcus. Please, just let me—" "Let you what? Go crying to the guards again?" Marcus stepped closer, his smile never reaching his eyes. "We both know how that worked out last time. Nobody cares about you here, Chen. Nobody's coming to save you." But Marcus was wrong. Thomas Wright had responded to the commotion near the rec room and immediately recognized it as a diversion tactic. He'd seen Marcus use the same strategy before. His gut told him to check the showers, so he'd called for backup on his radio and headed that way, his heart pounding. As he approached, he could hear Marcus's voice echoing off the tile walls. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, predatory, controlling, dangerous. Thomas reached for his phone, the same one he'd been using to document Marcus's activities for months. He knew what he was about to do violated department policy. Personal recording devices weren't allowed during duty hours. Any evidence he gathered might be inadmissible. He could be fired, prosecuted, sued. But none of that mattered when he heard David's cry of pain. Thomas activated his phone's video recording and stepped into the shower area. What he saw would be burned into his memory forever. Marcus had David pressed against the wall, one massive hand around the smaller man's throat, the other drawn back in a fist. "Step away from him, now!" Thomas's voice was steady, authoritative, but his hands were shaking as he held up his phone, making sure the camera captured everything. Marcus froze, his eyes widening with surprise and then narrowing with calculation. He released David, who collapsed to the wet floor, gasping for air. "Officer Wright, I was just having a conversation with my friend here. Right, David?" "The conversation's over," Thomas said. He kept the phone raised, recording everything. "David, go to the medical unit. Marcus, hands behind your back." Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, fear, and finally, a cold smugness. "You recording this on your personal phone, Officer Wright? That's against policy, isn't it? Seems to me you might be in more trouble than I am." Thomas had considered this moment many times. He'd run through the scenarios, weighed the consequences. "Maybe so," he admitted. "But at least I'll sleep tonight knowing I did the right thing." Backup arrived moments later, Officers Rodriguez and Kim responding to Thomas's call. They secured Marcus and escorted him to solitary confinement pending investigation. David was taken to the medical unit, where the physician documented extensive bruising consistent with assault, and Thomas went to his supervisor's office to face the consequences of his actions. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been running Cell Block D for 7 years. She was tough, fair, and by the book. When Thomas walked into her office with his phone and his story, she listened without interrupting. "You know I should fire you," she said when he finished. "You violated half a dozen policies tonight." "Yes, ma'am, I know. But you also may have saved a man's life." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "How long have you been documenting Marcus Reynolds?" Thomas met her eyes. 3 months, ma'am. I have 47 videos, over 200 photographs, and detailed notes on his patterns and activities." Captain Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Thomas never expected. "Show me everything." The evidence unfolds. Thomas Wright sat across from Captain Mitchell in her cramped office, his phone connected to her computer. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they began reviewing 3 months of carefully documented evidence. Each video, each photograph told a story of systematic abuse that had been invisible to the official surveillance system. "This was August 15th, Thomas explained, clicking on a video file. "Watch Marcus's movements during lunch. See how he positions himself near the serving line? He's timing David's arrival. The video showed Marcus casually bumping into David, causing him to drop his tray food scattered across the floor. Other inmates laughed. No guards intervened. It looked like an accident. Now watch this. From the same day. Different angle. Thomas played another clip. See how he deliberately stepped into David's path? It wasn't an accident. It never is. Captain Mitchell leaned closer to the screen, her expression darkening. Why didn't the cameras catch this? Because Marcus is smart. He operates in the spaces between official oversight. The cameras show the result, but not the intent, not the pattern. Thomas pulled up a spreadsheet he'd created. I've logged every interaction between Marcus and David, plus 23 other inmates who've shown similar patterns of bruising, behavioral changes, or complaints that went nowhere. The captain scrolled through the data, her jaw tightening. 23 others? Yes, ma'am. David Chen is just the latest. Before him, there was Robert Miller, who requested a transfer to another facility after only 2 months here. And before that, Kevin Santos, who spent 3 weeks in the infirmary with what was officially reported as a slip in the shower. I remember Santos, Mitchell said quietly. He wouldn't tell us what really happened. Because he was terrified. They all were. Thomas opened another folder. I've documented the network too. Marcus doesn't work alone. He has 4 loyal followers who help him control the block. James Morrison, called Razor, who creates diversions. Luis Ortega, who acts as lookout. Deshaun Harris, who intimidates potential witnesses. And Ryan Burke, who spreads rumors to isolate victims. Captain Mitchell looked at Thomas with a mixture of respect and concern. You've built a comprehensive case here, but you've also put yourself in serious legal jeopardy. The union is going to have a field day with this, and Marcus's lawyer will argue that every piece of evidence was obtained illegally. I know. Thomas had accepted this reality months ago, but I couldn't keep watching it happen. My daughter, Emma, she's about David's age. She asks me what I do at work, and I tell her I protect people. How could I look her in the eye if I didn't actually do that? The captain was silent for a moment, then picked up her phone. I'm calling the warden and the district attorney's office. This is bigger than department policy now. This is a criminal investigation. Over the next 2 hours, Captain Mitchell's office filled with people. Warden James Peterson arrived first, his face grave as he reviewed the evidence. Then came Assistant District Attorney Lisa Thornton, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in prison violence cases. Finally, the facility's legal counsel, Robert Chen, no relation to David, joined them. They watched every video. They examined every photograph. They read Thomas's meticulous notes, which included timestamps, locations, witness accounts, and cross-references with official incident reports. This is extraordinary work, Ada Thornton said, her eyes never leaving the screen. It's also, unfortunately, largely inadmissible in court. Officer Wright, you were on duty during most of these recordings, correct? Yes, ma'am. Using personal recording devices while on duty violates state correctional officer regulations, union agreements, and potentially inmates' privacy rights. Any defense attorney will have this thrown out immediately. She turned to face him. But here's what we can do. Your evidence establishes probable cause for a formal investigation. We can install additional cameras, assign undercover officers, and most importantly, move David Chen and the other potential victims to protective custody while we build a proper case. Warden Peterson nodded. I want a complete review of Cell Block D operations. Captain Mitchell, you'll lead it. Officer Wright, you're on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into your policy violations. Thomas had expected this. I understand, sir. However, the warden continued, unofficially, you may have exposed a systematic failure in our security protocols. If we'd been doing our jobs properly, you wouldn't have needed to risk your career to protect inmates. That's on us, not you. Ida Thornton gathered her notes. I'll need copies of everything. We're opening a criminal investigation into Marcus Reynolds for assault, terroristic threats, and conspiracy. Officer Wright, you'll need legal representation. The Correctional Officers Union should provide it, but given the circumstances, you might want private counsel. I've already retained someone, Thomas admitted. I knew this day was coming. As the meeting broke up, Captain Mitchell pulled Thomas aside. "You did the right thing. It might cost you, but you did right. And for what it's worth, I'm going to fight to keep you on my team." Thomas nodded, exhausted but relieved. The truth was finally out. But he knew the real battle was just beginning. Meanwhile, in solitary confinement, Marcus Reynolds sat on a concrete bunk, his mind racing. He'd underestimated Officer Wright, assumed he was just another bureaucrat following protocols. That was a mistake. But Marcus had survived worse situations. He had friends, both inside and outside the prison. He had money stashed away. And he had information, compromising information about guards, inmates, and prison operations that could be very valuable to the right people. If they thought they'd beaten him, they were wrong. This was just the beginning. The ripple effect. News of Marcus Reynolds' arrest spread through Riverside State Penitentiary like wildfire. By the next morning, every inmate in Cell Block D knew what had happened in the showers, but the reactions were mixed and complicated, revealing fault lines in the prison's social structure that had existed for years. David Chen sat in a private room in the medical unit, still trembling. The physician, Dr. Amanda Foster, had documented his injuries: bruising around his throat, a cracked rib, various contusions. But it was the psychological damage that concerned her most. "You're safe now," Dr. Foster said gently, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Marcus is in solitary, and there's talk of transferring you to another facility." "I don't want special treatment," David whispered. His voice was hoarse from the assault. "I just want to do my time and go home to my family." "Special treatment?" A new voice came from the doorway. Captain Mitchell stepped into the room. "Mr. Chen, you're not getting special treatment. You're getting what every inmate deserves: safety and dignity. We failed you. Officer Wright saw that failure and took action. Now we're going to make it right." David looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. 23 others. Officer Wright said there were 23 others before me. Why did it take so long? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because it was one. Captain Mitchell pulled up a chair and sat down, meeting David's eyes directly. "Because we weren't looking closely enough. Because we trusted a system that had gaps. Because men like Marcus Reynolds are experts at exploiting those gaps, but mostly because the people who were suffering stayed silent out of fear, and we didn't work hard enough to make them feel safe enough to speak up." "What happens now?" David asked. "Now we investigate properly. We interview every inmate Marcus had contact with. We install additional cameras. We retrain our staff. And we make sure this never happens again." She paused. "But I need your help. Will you testify about what happened to you?" David was quiet for a long moment, fear and courage warring on his face. Finally, he nodded. "Yes. If it means others won't go through this. Yes." While this conversation was happening, another was taking place in the administrative wing. Thomas Wright sat with his union representative, a seasoned officer named Patricia Gomez, and his private attorney, Michael Harris. "The warden is recommending a 10-day suspension without pay for policy violations," Patricia explained. "That's actually lenient, given the circumstances. But there's a catch. You'll be required to undergo retraining on surveillance protocols and evidence collection, and you'll be reassigned to a different cell block when you return." "Reassigned?" Thomas frowned. "Why?" "Because Marcus Reynolds has friends," Michael Harris said bluntly. "And some of them wear badges. You've made enemies, Thomas. Powerful ones. The administration needs to create distance between you and Cell Block D for your own safety." Thomas thought about this. He'd known there might be retaliation, but he hadn't fully considered the implications. "What about Captain Mitchell? Is she in danger?" "She can handle herself," Patricia said. "She's been asking questions that needed to be asked for a long time. Some of the guards are defensive about it, but most respect her. You're the one who went rogue, so you're the target." In Cell Block D, the power vacuum Marcus's removal had created was already causing tensions. His 4 associates, Razor Morrison, Luis Ortega, Deshaun Harris, and Ryan Burke, were scrambling to maintain control. But without Marcus's intelligence and strategic thinking, their efforts were clumsy and obvious. Officer Rodriguez, one of the responders to the shower incident, noticed the change immediately during morning headcount. The usual rigid hierarchy seemed fractured. Inmates who'd previously walked with their eyes down were making eye contact. Small groups were forming in corners, whispering conversations that stopped when guards approached. "Something's brewing," Rodriguez told Officer Kim during their break. "The whole block feels different." "Different how?" Kim asked. "Like everyone's waiting for something, like the pressure's building." Rodriguez had been working corrections for 12 years and had learned to trust his instincts. "We need to be ready for anything." His instincts were correct. That afternoon, during recreation time, 3 inmates who'd been terrorized by Marcus approached Officer Williams together. Their spokesman was Robert Miller, the man who'd requested a transfer months earlier. "Officer Williams, we'd like to give statements," Miller said, his voice shaking but determined. "About Marcus Reynolds. About what really happened to us." Williams looked at the 3 men. Miller, a middle-aged man serving time for fraud. Kevin Santos, the young man who'd been hospitalized after his shower incident. And Jerome Washington, an older inmate who'd been at Riverside for 8 years. "Why now?" Williams asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because Officer Wright proved someone gives a damn," Washington said. "He risked everything to help David Chen. If we don't speak up now, we're saying his sacrifice didn't matter. We're saying the next guy deserves to suffer in silence, too." By the end of that day, 7 more inmates had come forward with stories of abuse, intimidation, and violence at Marcus's hands. Each interview was carefully documented, this time through official channels with proper protocol. Captain Mitchell personally oversaw each one, ensuring every victim felt heard and protected, but victory was tempered by a troubling discovery. While reviewing security footage from the past week, trying to establish timelines for the investigation, Captain Mitchell noticed something odd. In several clips, guards seemed to look away at crucial moments. In others, they were conspicuously absent from areas they should have been patrolling. She called in Officer Rodriguez, one of the few guards she trusted implicitly. "Look at this footage from last Tuesday, 2 hours before the shower incident. Where is Officer Brennan? He was supposed to be monitoring this corridor." Rodriguez studied the screen, his expression darkening. "He's not in frame at all during Marcus's entire movement from his cell to the showers. That's not standard positioning. Now look at this, from 3 weeks ago." Mitchell pulled up another file. "Same pattern. Brennan's somehow never in frame when Marcus is moving to commit an assault." "You think Brennan was bought?" Rodriguez asked carefully. "I think we need to investigate everyone," Mitchell said grimly. "Marcus didn't operate alone. The inmates were just the visible part of his network. Allies and enemies." The investigation into Marcus Reynolds' prison empire was expanding in ways Captain Mitchell hadn't anticipated. As more inmates came forward, a disturbing picture emerged, not just of one bully, but of a sophisticated criminal operation that had flourished under the noses of prison administration for years. Thomas Wright, now on suspension, received a call from Captain Mitchell on his 3rd day at home. "We need to talk, off the record." They met at a coffee shop 40 minutes from the prison, far enough that they wouldn't encounter co-workers. Mitchell looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept much since the shower incident. "I've been reviewing everything," she said, sliding into the booth across from Thomas. "Your documentation was better than you realized. You didn't just catch Marcus committing assaults, you caught the pattern of guard absences around those assaults." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "You think guards were helping him?" "I think some guards were being paid to look the other way, and possibly worse." Mitchell pulled out a tablet, keeping it angled so only Thomas could see. "Look at this rotation schedule. Every single time Marcus made a move on a victim, Officer Brennan was either absent or positioned exactly where he couldn't see what was happening. The odds of that being coincidence are astronomical." "Brennan's been there for 20 years, Thomas said, shocked. "He's senior to both of us, which made him valuable to Marcus. He knew the systems, the blind spots, the protocols." Mitchell swiped to another document. But it's not just Brennan. I found irregularities with 3 other officers, and that's just from a preliminary review. Thomas stared at the evidence, feeling sick. How deep does this go? That's what we need to find out. The DA's office is bringing in the State Police Investigation Unit. This isn't just about assault anymore. This is corruption, possibly racketeering. Marcus wasn't just bullying people for fun. He was running a protection racket, controlling contraband flow, and likely coordinating with people outside the prison. How can I help? Thomas asked. I'm suspended. I don't even have access to the facility. Mitchell smiled grimly. That's actually perfect. I need someone Marcus's network doesn't see as a threat right now. Someone who can look into financial records, interview former employees, maybe talk to some of Marcus's known associates outside the prison. Unofficially, of course. You're asking me to do more unofficial investigation? The first one almost ended my career. The first one saved lives and exposed a cancer in our system, Mitchell corrected. Now I'm asking you to help us cut it out completely. But Thomas, if you say no, I understand. You've risked enough. Thomas thought about David Chen's terrified face, about the 23 other victims, about his daughter Emma, who still believed her father was a hero. Tell me what you need. Over the next week, Thomas became a different kind of investigator. Working with ADA Lisa Thornton's guidance and authorization, he began tracking Marcus Reynolds' financial trail. Prison records showed Marcus had no legitimate income source, yet he'd been making regular payments to an outside account, allegedly for his elderly mother's care. Except his mother died 6 years ago, Thornton told Thomas during one of their meetings. So where's that money really going? Thomas followed the trail to a series of shell companies and discovered something startling. Marcus had been operating a sophisticated money laundering operation. Drugs came into the prison through corrupt guards. Marcus controlled distribution. Profits went out through fake family support payments, then got laundered through legitimate businesses owned by Marcus's associates on the outside. It's brilliant, in a criminal sort of way, Thornton admitted. The prison system is full of inmates sending money to family. Nobody looks twice at it. And Marcus was careful. Never too much at once, always just below reporting thresholds. Meanwhile, inside Riverside, the investigation was creating chaos. Warden Peterson had brought in the state police, who were interviewing every guard in Cell Block D. Officer Brennan had been placed on administrative leave, along with 2 others whose financial records showed suspicious deposits. The inmates sensed the upheaval and reacted in various ways. Some, like David Chen and the other victims, felt hopeful for the first time in months. Others, particularly those who'd benefited from Marcus's criminal network, were nervous and angry. Razor Morrison, Marcus's closest associate, tried to hold the operation together, but he lacked his boss's intelligence and strategic thinking. During a poorly planned contraband transfer, he was caught by Officer Rodriguez with 3 burner phones and significant quantities of drugs. "Where'd you get these?" Rodriguez demanded. Razor knew he was finished. His loyalty to Marcus warred with his instinct for self-preservation. "I want to make a deal," he said finally. "I'll tell you everything, but I want protection and a transfer." The information Razor provided was devastating. He detailed the entire operation, which guards were on the payroll, how contraband entered the prison, how Marcus orchestrated assaults to maintain control, and most damning, how he'd been coordinating with a drug distribution network operating across 3 states. Marcus was planning to expand, Razor revealed during his formal interview with state police. He wanted to set up similar operations in 4 other prisons. He had connections with the Mexican cartels, with local gangs, with corrupt guards in multiple facilities. This place was just his testing ground. The scope of the conspiracy shocked even seasoned investigators. What had started as Thomas Wright documenting a prison bully had uncovered a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Riverside's walls. But the revelations came with dangers. As word spread about Razor's cooperation, there was an attempt on his life in the transport van taking him to a different facility. Only quick action by the transport guards prevented his murder, and Thomas received a threatening phone call on his personal line. "Stop digging," a distorted voice told him, "or your daughter pays the price." Thomas immediately contacted the police and ADA Thornton. Emma was placed under protective watch, and Thomas moved his family to a safe house temporarily. The investigation had become personal in the most frightening way. We're close to breaking this wide open, Thornton told him. Marcus's outside associates are getting desperate. That's when people make mistakes. But Thomas, if you want to step back, if this is too much risk for your family, no one will blame you. Thomas looked at a photo of Emma on his phone. She was smiling, proud of her father, believing he stood for something. No, he said firmly. We finish this. We bring them all down. Because if we stop now, if we let them intimidate us into silence, then everyone who suffered, everyone who was afraid to speak up, everyone who's counting on us, we fail them all. All right then, Thornton said. Let's end this. The walls close. In Marcus Reynolds sat in solitary confinement, a concrete cell measuring 8 by 10 feet. He'd been there for 2 weeks, with no communication beyond his attorney's visits. But Marcus was resourceful, and even solitary couldn't completely isolate him. He'd spent years building networks, establishing leverage, creating insurance policies against exactly this situation. His attorney, Gerald Blackwood, was expensive and ruthless. During their latest visit, conducted through reinforced glass with phone communication, Blackwood delivered mixed news. The good news is, the evidence against you for the assault on David Chen is problematic, Blackwood said. Officer Wright's recording was obtained in violation of department policy. I've filed motions to suppress it. We have a strong argument for dismissal. And the bad news? Marcus asked calmly. The bad news is they've flipped Morrison. He's given them everything. The drug operation, the corrupt guards, the outside connections. They're building a RICO case. Federal charges. Marcus, this isn't just assault anymore. They're going after you for racketeering and conspiracy. Marcus showed no emotion, but internally he was calculating rapidly. Razor's betrayal had been predictable, almost inevitable. But it accelerated the timeline. He needed to move quickly. What about the insurance? Marcus asked quietly. Blackwood leaned closer to the phone. That's complicated. Some of the material you have on people is explosive, yes. But using it could make things worse for you. It's mutually assured destruction. Then let's make sure everyone understands that, Marcus said. Make some calls. Remind certain people what I know, what I have documented, what gets released. If anything happens to me, I need you to be very clear about the consequences of this investigation continuing. Blackwood hesitated. Marcus, that's extortion. If I'm caught facilitating, then don't get caught, Marcus interrupted. You're paid very well to handle delicate situations. Handle this one. Outside the legal maneuvering, the human impact of Marcus's operation was becoming clearer. David Chen had been transferred to a minimum security facility where he could finish his sentence in safety. Before leaving, he'd recorded a detailed video statement for the trial, describing not just the physical assault, but months of psychological torture. He made me feel worthless, David said to the camera, his voice breaking. Every day I wondered if it would be the day he killed me. And the worst part was thinking no one cared, that this was just how prison was supposed to be. Similar statements were being collected from the other 23 victims Thomas had identified. Each story was heartbreaking. Men who'd been broken down, terrorized, left with psychological scars that would take years to heal. Thomas watched these interviews from the state police office where he was now working as a consultant. Each one reinforced why he'd risked everything. But the threats against Emma weighed on him constantly. His family was safe in the protection program, but he knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. They needed to close the case. We've identified Marcus's main outside contact, Detective Sarah Chen from the state police told Thomas during a briefing. His name is Victor Molina, connected to the Sinaloa cartel's distribution network. He's been using prison networks across 5 states to move product. Marcus was his star operator. Smart, ruthless, effective. Have you brought Molina in? Thomas asked. We're building the case carefully. He's slippery, with expensive lawyers and legitimate business fronts, but we're monitoring his communications, following the money. When we move, it needs to stick. The investigation was expanding beyond anything Thomas had imagined. What he'd thought was one bully terrorizing inmates had turned out to be a node in a vast criminal network. The FBI was now involved, coordinating with state police and the prison system. But inside Riverside, something else was happening. The exposure of corruption was creating an opportunity for change. Warden Peterson, working with Captain Mitchell, had implemented sweeping reforms. New cameras eliminated blind spots. Guard rotations were randomized to prevent corruption patterns. Most importantly, they'd established an anonymous reporting system that inmates could access without fear of retaliation. "We're rebuilding trust," Captain Mitchell told Thomas during one of their regular check-ins. "It's slow, but inmates are starting to believe they can speak up safely. We've had a dozen reports in the past week alone, not about Marcus, but about other issues that were festering in the dark." "That's because of what you're doing," Thomas said, "creating real accountability." "No, it's because of what you did. You showed them someone was willing to fight for them. That matters more than any policy change." As the investigation progressed, cracks began appearing in Marcus's network. Two of the corrupt guards, facing federal charges and evidence of their financial crimes, agreed to cooperate. Their testimony provided detailed information about how the drug operation functioned, corroborating Razor's account. Officer Brennan, the senior guard who'd been Marcus's main inside facilitator, remained silent, refusing to cooperate. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records showing deposits that coincided exactly with drug deliveries. Testimony from multiple sources. Video footage that Thomas had captured showing Brennan's suspicious absences. Then came a break in the case that changed everything. Victor Molina, feeling pressure from the expanding investigation, made a mistake. He tried to eliminate Razor Morrison, who was now in protective custody. The assassination attempt was foiled, and two of Molina's operatives were captured. Under interrogation, one of them revealed something shocking. Marcus Reynolds had been recording conversations with everyone he worked with, including Molina. He had hours of audio documenting their criminal conspiracy, stored in a secure location as insurance. "Where?" A.D. Thornton demanded. "I don't know the exact location," the operative said, "but it exists." Marcus told Victor it was his life insurance policy. If anything happened to him, the recordings get released to law enforcement. This revelation changed the calculus of the entire case. Those recordings could bring down not just Marcus and Molina, but everyone involved in the network. The question was, could they find them? And more importantly, could they find them before Marcus realized they knew about them? The search for truth. The existence of Marcus Reynolds' secret recordings sent the investigation in a new direction. Federal agents, state police, prison investigators, all focused on one question. Where would a prisoner hide evidence significant enough to take down a drug cartel? "He's been in prison for 3 years," FBI agent Robert Torres told the investigation team. "He has no private property, no personal space beyond his cell. Everything is subject to search, so where could he possibly hide recordings?" Thomas Wright, sitting in on the meeting, thought back to his months of observing Marcus. "He wouldn't keep them inside the prison," he said slowly. "Too risky. But he'd need access to them, need to be able to prove they exist and threaten their release." "So someone on the outside has them," A.D.A. Thornton concluded. "But who? His attorney?" "Blackwood would never risk his license by holding evidence of crimes," Agent Torres said. "Attorney-client privilege has limits." Captain Mitchell, studying Marcus's visitor logs, found something interesting. He's had regular visits from his sister, Nicole Reynolds, every 2 weeks like clockwork. She lives in Springfield, about 90 miles from here. "Let's talk to her." Torres decided Nicole Reynolds was 38 years old, a dental hygienist with no criminal record. When FBI agents arrived at her modest home, she was cooperative but visibly nervous. "Yes, I visit my brother regularly," she confirmed. "He's still my family, despite everything he's done." "Has he ever asked you to hold anything for him?" Agent Torres asked carefully. "Documents, recordings, computer drives?" Nicole's hands trembled slightly. "I want immunity before I answer any more questions." Her response told them everything. After tense negotiations involving attorneys and prosecutors, Nicole agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. What she revealed was both shocking and entirely predictable. "Marcus gave me a storage unit key 2 years ago," she said. "He told me it contained insurance, and that if anything ever happened to him, if he was killed or disappeared, I should send the contents to the FBI, the DEA, and every major news organization I could find." "Did you ever look at what was inside?" Thornton asked. "No," Marcus said it was safer if I didn't know, but he was very clear. The unit was his protection. As long as people knew it existed, they'd think twice about harming him. The storage unit was in a facility 30 miles from the prison, rented under Nicole's name, but paid for with money. Marcus had funneled out through his criminal operation. When federal agents opened it, they found something more valuable than they'd imagined. Dozens of micro-cassette tapes, meticulously labeled with dates and names, a digital voice recorder with hundreds of files, and detailed notebooks documenting every conversation, every transaction, every criminal act Marcus had been involved in for 6 years. 3 years before his incarceration, and 3 years inside Riverside. "This is extraordinary," Agent Torres said, carefully documenting the evidence. He recorded everything: phone calls with Molina, conversations with corrupt guards, negotiations with other inmates. This is his entire criminal enterprise, self-documented. "Why would he do this?" a younger agent asked. "It's evidence against himself." "Because it's evidence against everyone else too," Thomas said, understanding Marcus's psychology. He was creating mutually assured destruction. If they betrayed him, he'd drag them all down. It was his way of controlling people even more dangerous than himself. The recordings were devastating. They captured Victor Molina discussing drug shipments in explicit detail. They documented Officer Brennan accepting bribes and coordinating contraband delivery schedules. They revealed a network of corruption extending to court officials, parole board members, and even a state legislator who'd been receiving payments to ensure favorable treatment for certain inmates. "This is going to explode like a bomb," ADA Thornton said, listening to the recordings. "We're not just talking about prison corruption anymore. This touches the state government, the judicial system, law enforcement agencies." Warden Peterson, called in to hear some of the recordings, looked physically ill. "How did we miss this? How did this operate right under our noses for years?" "Because people like Marcus are exceptional at finding and exploiting weaknesses," Captain Mitchell said. "He studied the system, identified the gaps, and built an empire in those gaps. And he documented everything because he understood that information is power." Back in solitary confinement, Marcus was growing uneasy. He hadn't heard from his attorney in 3 days, which was unusual. The guards who brought his meals were different, unfamiliar faces who wouldn't meet his eyes. Something had changed. His instincts were correct. Federal agents had arrested Victor Molina, along with 18 members of his distribution network. Officer Brennan and 3 other corrupt guards had been taken into custody. And most significantly, they'd executed search warrants on Gerald Blackwood's office, seizing documents related to Marcus's case. When Blackwood finally visited Marcus, his confident demeanor was gone. "They found the storage unit," he said without preamble. "They have all your recordings." Marcus felt something he rarely experienced: fear. Nicole was offered immunity. She cooperated fully. "Marcus, they have everything. Every conversation you recorded as insurance is now evidence against you. The federal prosecutor is talking about life without parole, possibly death penalty for conspiracy to commit murder." "The recordings implicate half the people involved," Marcus said, trying to maintain control. "They can't use them without exposing their own people." "That's exactly what they're doing. The state attorney general has announced a massive corruption investigation. Heads are rolling across the state. You created the evidence that's bringing down everyone, including yourself. Your insurance policy has become your death warrant." For the first time in years, Marcus Reynolds had no move to make, no angle to play. He'd been outmaneuvered by the very system he'd thought he'd mastered. Outside the prison, Thomas Wright watched the news coverage with his family, finally home from protective custody. The scandal was national news. "Massive prison corruption network exposed," read the headlines. His role in starting the investigation was mentioned, though the media focus was primarily on the federal raids and high-profile arrests. Emma, his daughter, hugged him tight. "You did it, Dad. You actually did it." Thomas thought about David Chen, about the 23 other victims, about all the people who'd suffered in silence. "We did it," he corrected. "Everyone who had the courage to speak up, everyone who refused to look away. That's how this happened." But even as justice unfolded, Thomas knew the story wasn't over. The recordings would lead to trials that might last years. Corrupt officials would fight back. The system Marcus had exploited would need fundamental reform. The real work was just beginning. Consequences and Accountability. 6 months after the discovery of Marcus Reynolds' recordings, the legal and institutional fallout was still unfolding. The federal courthouse had become the center of one of the largest corruption trials in state history, with 27 defendants facing charges ranging from bribery to racketeering to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. Thomas Wright, reinstated to his position at Riverside after the 10-day suspension, found himself spending more time in courtrooms than in the prison. He was a key witness, his testimony and documentation forming the foundation for multiple cases. Officer Wright, can you describe what first made you suspicious of Marcus Reynolds? The federal prosecutor asked during Victor Molina's trial. Thomas looked at the jury, 12 ordinary citizens who held the power to deliver justice. It wasn't one thing. It was a pattern. I saw an inmate, David Chen, becoming increasingly withdrawn, showing signs of trauma. I saw other inmates avoiding certain areas of the prison at certain times. I saw Marcus Reynolds moving through the facility like he owned it, and I saw guards who somehow never noticed what he was doing. What made you decide to document his activities on your own? Because I reported my concerns through official channels and nothing changed. The system we had in place wasn't catching what was happening. So I had to ask myself, was I going to follow the rules and watch people get hurt? Or was I going to break the rules to protect them? I chose protection over protocol. The defense attorney, during cross-examination, tried to undermine Thomas's credibility. Officer Wright, you violated multiple department policies, correct? You used unauthorized recording devices, conducted surveillance without warrants, and breached inmates' privacy rights. Yes, I did, Thomas admitted. So you're admitting you broke the law? I'm admitting I broke department policy to expose criminal activity that was being facilitated by that same department. I'm not proud of violating the rules I swore to uphold. But I'm not sorry for protecting people who desperately needed someone to fight for them. His honesty resonated with the jury. More importantly, it resonated with the judge, who later commented in her ruling that Thomas's actions, while technically improper, had been driven by legitimate concerns that the official system had failed to address. Victor Molina's trial was the first of many. The recordings Marcus had made proved devastatingly effective as evidence. Jurors heard Molina's voice discussing drug quantities, distribution networks, and payment structures. They heard him ordering the intimidation of witnesses and planning retaliatory violence. The verdict came after just 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts, Molina was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Officer Brennan's trial came next. The corruption charges against him were extensive: accepting bribes, facilitating drug trafficking, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. His defense argued that he'd been coerced by Marcus, that he'd been afraid for his own safety. But the recordings told a different story. They captured Brennan negotiating payment rates for his services, laughing about inmates who'd been assaulted, and planning how to avoid detection. When the prosecutor played one particular recording, Brennan dismissing David Chen's initial complaint with contempt, several jurors visibly reacted with disgust. Captain Mitchell, called to testify, delivered damning evidence about Brennan's systematic absence from his duties during key times. A guard's first responsibility is protecting the inmates in his care, she told the court. Officer Brennan not only failed that responsibility, he actively facilitated harm to the people he was supposed to protect. That's not coercion. That's calculated criminal conduct. Brennan received 22 years in federal prison. 2 other corrupt guards received similar sentences. The message was clear. Betraying the public trust carried severe consequences. The state legislator implicated in the recordings, Representative James Hartley, initially denied everything, but the audio evidence was irrefutable. His voice accepting payments to influence parole board decisions, to ensure favorable treatment for specific inmates, to block prison reform legislation that would have interfered with the drug operation. His trial became a media spectacle. Hartley had been a prominent voice on tough-on-crime policies, campaigning on his commitment to justice and public safety. The revelation that he'd been profiting from prison corruption while publicly championing harsher sentences sparked public outrage. You didn't just betray your office, the judge told Hartley during sentencing. You betrayed every citizen who believed your promises about justice. You betrayed every inmate trying to survive in a system you helped corrupt. 28 years in federal prison. As the trials continued, Reforms were being implemented at Riverside. Captain Mitchell, promoted to deputy warden, led a comprehensive overhaul of security protocols, guard training, and inmate protection measures. "We're installing facial recognition systems at all entry points," she explained to Thomas during a facility tour. "We're implementing randomized cell searches using algorithms that guards can't predict or manipulate. And we're creating a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints." The anonymous reporting system had been a particular success. Inmates could now report abuse, threats, or suspicious activity through secure terminals in the library and medical unit. Each report was reviewed by the oversight board, independent of prison administration. "We've had over 200 reports in 6 months," Mitchell said. "Most aren't about guards. They're about inmate-on-inmate issues, safety concerns, health problems. Things that used to fester in silence are now being addressed." Thomas walked through cell block D, noting the changes. The atmosphere was different, still tense, still challenging, but without the pervasive fear that had characterized Marcus's reign. Inmates made eye contact with guards. There were conversations instead of just orders and compliance. David Chen, though transferred to another facility, had sent Thomas a letter. "Officer Wright, I wanted you to know that I'm doing well. The nightmares are less frequent. I'm in counseling, working through the trauma. But more than that, I'm finishing my degree through the prison education program. I'll be released in 18 months. And I'll go home to my family as someone who survived and grew stronger. None of that would have been possible if you hadn't stood up for me. You taught me that one person's courage can change everything. I'll never forget that." Thomas kept that letter in his locker, reading it whenever the job felt overwhelming, because there were still hard days. The system wasn't perfect. There were still inmates who fell through cracks, still guards who cut corners, still challenges that seemed insurmountable. But the fundamental truth had changed. People were watching now. Accountability existed. The darkness Marcus had operated in had been exposed to light. And Marcus himself? His trial was scheduled for month 9 of the investigation, charged with 23 counts of assault, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder. His own recordings had provided the bulk of the evidence against him. His new attorney, after Gerald Blackwood was disbarred for ethical violations, recommended a plea deal. Marcus, for perhaps the first time in his life, had no leverage, no angles, no way out. The question was, would he accept responsibility, or would he force his victims to relive their trauma in a trial? The reckoning. Marcus Reynolds sat in the defendant's chair, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual commissary-bought clothes. The courtroom was packed. Victims, their families, reporters, reform advocates, and citizens who'd followed the case through months of media coverage. Judge Catherine Morrison presided, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and no tolerance for manipulation. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence, listened to every recording, and read every victim's statement. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, "you've rejected multiple plea offers from the prosecution. You've insisted on proceeding to trial, which is your right. But I want to be clear. If you're convicted on all counts, the sentencing guidelines suggest life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice calm and controlled. He'd lost everything. His prison empire, his outside connections, his freedom. But he still had his intelligence, his strategic mind. He had one last move to make. "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing, "I'd like to address the court before we proceed." The prosecutor, a seasoned federal attorney named Patricia Reynolds, no relation, looked surprised. Marcus's attorney, court-appointed and clearly out of his depth, seemed equally confused. Judge Morrison considered for a moment. "This is highly irregular, but I'll allow it. Mr. Reynolds, you may speak." Marcus turned to face the gallery, his eyes moving across the faces. David Chen, now attending via video link. Robert Miller, Kevin Santos, Jerome Washington. All the others he'd terrorized. Thomas Wright sat in the back row, watching carefully. "I've spent the last 9 months in solitary confinement," Marcus began. "That's a lot of time to think. A lot of time to understand what I built and what it cost." He paused. "I could stand here and make excuses. I could talk about my own childhood, about abuse I suffered, about how the system failed me first. Those things are true. But they don't excuse what I did." The courtroom was completely silent. I systematically terrorized 23 human beings, Marcus continued. I created an atmosphere of fear and violence. I corrupted guards and officials. I built a criminal enterprise that poisoned not just one prison, but potentially many others. And I did it all with cold calculation, believing I was smart enough to never face consequences. He looked directly at David Chen's image on the video screen. Mr. Chen, you tried to report what I was doing, and I made sure nothing happened. I wanted you to feel powerless, to understand that I controlled everything. I wanted you to know that no one would help you. I was wrong. Officer Wright helped you. Captain Mitchell helped you. The system, despite its flaws, eventually helped you, and I was the one who ended up powerless. David Chen, visible on the screen, had tears streaming down his face. Marcus turned back to Judge Morrison. Your Honor, I'm changing my plea. On all counts, I plead guilty. I don't want a trial. I don't want these men to have to testify and relive what I did to them. I don't want to waste the court's time or the taxpayers' money on a trial where the outcome is inevitable. Mr. Reynolds, the judge said carefully, do you understand what you're doing? A guilty plea on these charges virtually guarantees life imprisonment. I understand completely, Your Honor, and it's what I deserve. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, while we appreciate the defendant's change of plea, the people are concerned this might be a manipulation tactic. Mr. Reynolds has a documented history of strategic behavior designed to serve his interests. That's a fair concern, Judge Morrison said. Mr. Reynolds, why should I believe this is genuine? Marcus met her eyes. Because I have nothing left to gain, Your Honor. I lost. Officer Wright, a man I never even considered a threat, took me down. He did it because he cared about people I saw as weak and disposable. He risked his career and his family's safety because he understood something I never did. That courage isn't about physical strength or strategic intelligence. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. He gestured to his attorney. I'm instructing my counsel to not only accept the guilty plea, but to recommend the maximum sentence on all counts. I want these victims, and anyone else watching, to understand that actions have consequences, that justice, even delayed, eventually comes. Thomas Wright, listening from the back of the courtroom, felt a complex mixture of emotions. Was this genuine remorse? Or was Marcus playing one last angle, trying to control his narrative even in defeat? Captain Mitchell, sitting beside Thomas, whispered, "What do you think?" "I think," Thomas said quietly, "that sometimes broken people finally understand they're broken. Whether it changes anything, I don't know." Judge Morrison addressed the victims. Mr. Chen, Mr. Miller, Mr. Santos, and the other victims who are present. You've suffered tremendously because of this man's actions. His guilty plea means you won't have to testify, won't have to relive your trauma in open court. But it also means you won't have your day to confront him directly. I want to hear from you. What do you want to happen? David Chen spoke first. His voice transmitted clearly through the video system. Your Honor, I don't need to confront him. I just need to know he can't hurt anyone else. If his guilty plea accomplishes that, if it means we can move forward instead of spending months in a trial, then I support it. One by one, the other victims agreed. They wanted closure, not confrontation. They wanted to rebuild their lives, not spend more time focused on the man who'd tried to destroy them. Judge Morrison made her decision. Mr. Reynolds, I'm accepting your guilty plea. Sentencing will occur in 30 days, which will allow me to review all victim impact statements and pre-sentencing reports. Until then, you'll remain in federal custody. This court is adjourned. As Marcus was led away, he made brief eye contact with Thomas Wright. There was no hostility in his gaze, no threat, just acknowledgement. One man recognizing another who'd beaten him at his own game. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the victims and their advocates. Thomas avoided the cameras, but Captain Mitchell gave a brief statement. Today represents accountability, not just for Marcus Reynolds, but for a system that allowed him to operate for years. We've implemented reforms at Riverside State Penitentiary, but this work extends far beyond one facility. Every prison in America needs to examine its protocols, its culture, its commitment to protecting the people in its care, both inmates and staff. That's Marcus Reynolds' real legacy, forcing us to confront our failures and do better. 30 days later, at the sentencing hearing, Judge Morrison delivered her judgment. Mr. Reynolds, you orchestrated a criminal enterprise that caused immeasurable harm. Your victims carry scars, physical and psychological, that may never fully heal you. Corrupted public officials, poisoned the justice system, and created an atmosphere of terror. However, you ultimately cooperated with authorities, provided evidence that brought down a larger criminal network, and pleaded guilty, sparing your victims further trauma. These factors have been considered. On the assault charges, 23 counts, 15 years each, to run consecutively, 345 years. On the racketeering charges, life imprisonment. On the conspiracy charges, an additional 50 years. Total sentence, life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus 395 years. The sentence was symbolic. Marcus would never be free again. The consecutive sentencing ensured that even if some charges were overturned on appeal, he'd remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, Marcus looked at the victims one last time. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of the debt he could never repay. Justice, at last, had been served. Transformation and hope. 2 years after Marcus Reynolds' sentencing, Riverside State Penitentiary had become a model for prison reform. Criminologists, corrections officials, and policy advocates from across the country visited to study the changes implemented in the wake of the corruption scandal. Thomas Wright had been promoted to training coordinator, responsible for educating new correctional officers about ethical conduct, inmate protection protocols, and recognizing signs of institutional corruption. His story, and his willingness to risk everything to do what was right, had become central to the training curriculum. The most important thing you need to understand, Thomas told a class of new recruits, is that your job isn't about punishment. It's about safety and human dignity. The people in these cells are human beings. Flawed, yes. Some dangerous, yes, but still human. And they're in our care. That means something. He showed them footage from the Marcus Reynolds case, not the sensational parts covered by media, but the quiet moments. David Chen's fearful face during his initial complaint that went nowhere. Inmates walking with their eyes down, trying to be invisible. The systematic failures that had allowed corruption to flourish. This happened because people looked away, Thomas explained. Because we prioritized following rules over protecting people. Because it was easier to ignore problems than to confront them. Every single one of you will face moments where you have to choose. Do I do what's convenient, or do I do what's right? Your answer to that question will define not just your career, but the kind of person you are. Captain Mitchell, now Warden Mitchell, having been promoted when Warden Peterson retired, had transformed the facility's culture systematically. The reforms went beyond technology and protocols. They addressed the fundamental relationship between guards and inmates. We've implemented restorative justice programs, she explained during a presentation to the state legislature's Corrections Committee. Inmates participate in conflict resolution circles, victim offender dialogues, and community accountability processes. We're not just warehousing people. We're preparing them to re-enter society as better citizens than when they arrived. The results were measurable. Violence in Cell Block D had decreased by 67%. Contraband confiscations were down by 43%, suggesting the supply network had been effectively disrupted. Inmate complaints were up by 200%, which Mitchell considered a positive indicator. It means they trust the system enough to report problems, she said. Before, they suffered in silence. Now they speak up, and we address issues before they escalate. David Chen had been released from prison 18 months earlier. He'd completed his degree in business administration through the prison education program and secured a job with a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals find employment and housing. He'd also become an advocate for prison reform, speaking publicly about his experiences and working with lawmakers to draft legislation, improving inmate protection measures. His testimony had been instrumental in passing the Corrections Accountability Act, which mandated independent oversight of all state correctional facilities. What happened to me shouldn't be possible, David told a legislative hearing. Marcus Reynolds was able to terrorize people for years because the system had blind spots, literal and figurative. We need transparency, accountability, And most importantly, we need people in corrections who see inmates as human beings worthy of protection. He'd also maintained contact with Thomas Wright, meeting quarterly for coffee to discuss ongoing reform efforts. Their relationship had evolved from guard and inmate to colleagues in a larger mission. "You saved my life," David told Thomas during one of these meetings. "I don't just mean physically, though you probably did that too. I mean you saved my sense of self-worth. You showed me that I mattered, that someone was willing to fight for me, that gave me the strength to rebuild." Thomas was uncomfortable with being called a hero. "I just did what anyone should have done." "But you're the one who actually did it," David insisted. "That's the difference between good intentions and real courage." The other victims had found their own paths to healing. Robert Miller had been released and reunited with his family. Kevin Santos was participating in the Restorative Justice Program, working through his trauma and learning conflict resolution skills. Jerome Washington, who had 8 more years on his sentence, had become a peer counselor, helping other inmates navigate prison life safely. The corrupt officials had faced their own reckonings. Victor Molina was serving 35 years in a maximum security federal prison. Officer Brennan was in a facility specifically for former law enforcement. Protected from the general population he'd once helped control, Representative Hartley had become a symbol of political corruption, his name synonymous with betraying public trust. And Marcus Reynolds? He'd been transferred to a maximum security federal prison in Colorado, where he spent 23 hours a day in his cell. Reports from prison officials indicated he'd become a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, participating in whatever limited programming was available to him. He'd also written a letter to David Chen, 1 year into his sentence. David had shared it with Thomas. "Mr. Chen, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I took from you and the others. I told myself you were weak, that survival of the fittest was nature's law. I was wrong. Real strength is what Officer Wright showed, standing up for someone else when there's nothing to gain and everything to lose. Real strength is what you showed, surviving my cruelty and choosing to help others instead of becoming bitter. I'll spend the rest of my life in a cell, and that's justice. I just hope that somehow, some good comes from the evil I did. That the reforms, the accountability, the changes, maybe they'll prevent the next Marcus Reynolds from doing what I did." "Do you believe he means it?" Thomas asked David after reading the letter David considered carefully. "I think he's capable of meaning it. Whether he actually does, I'm not sure it matters. The point isn't whether he's redeemed. The point is that the system changed. That future victims won't suffer what I did. That's the real transformation." 3 years after the initial incident in the showers, Thomas Wright stood before the American Corrections Association's annual conference, accepting an award for ethical courage in corrections. His daughter Emma, now 19 and studying criminal justice in college, sat in the front row, her face glowing with pride. "I'm honored to receive this recognition," Thomas said, holding the plaque. "But I want to be clear. I'm not a hero. I'm a corrections officer who did his job, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The real heroes are the victims who found the courage to speak up. David Chen, Robert Miller, Kevin Santos, and 20 others who said no more, despite their fear. They're the reason we're having these conversations about reform." He paused, looking out at the hundreds of corrections professionals in the audience. "Every one of you will face moments that test your character. Moments where doing the right thing costs something. Your comfort, your popularity, maybe even your career. I'm asking you to be ready for those moments, to remember why you entered this profession, to understand that the people in our care, regardless of their crimes, deserve basic human dignity and protection." Marcus Reynolds thrived because people looked away. He was defeated because someone finally looked closer. Be the person who looks closer. Be the person who acts when action is needed. Be the person who remembers that behind every badge, every uniform, every policy, there are human beings whose lives we can either improve or destroy by our choices. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. That evening, Thomas sat with his family, his wife Maria, Emma, and his younger son Carlos, at a restaurant near the conference hotel. They talked about the future, about Emma's studies, about Carlos's upcoming high school graduation. "Dad," Emma said, her eyes serious, "I used to worry about you, about the risks you took. But now I understand. You taught me that some things are worth risking everything for. That's the kind of person I want to be." Thomas felt tears well up. "Just be careful, okay? Be brave, but be smart. Change the world, but don't forget to protect yourself too." "Like you did?" Emma smiled. "I got lucky," Thomas admitted. "So many things could have gone wrong. But I also couldn't live with myself if I'd done nothing. That's the balance you'll have to find, between caution and courage, between self-preservation and standing up for others." As they finished dinner, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message from Captain Warden Mitchell. "FYI, we just had our 500th report through the anonymous system. A guard noticed another guard stealing commissary funds. Investigation opened immediately. The system is working. People are watching. They learned from you." Thomas showed the message to Maria, who squeezed his hand. "You started something important," she said softly. "Not just the investigation, but the idea that one person can make a difference. That speaking up matters. That justice is possible." "We started something," Thomas corrected. "Everyone who refused to stay silent. Everyone who chose courage over comfort. That's how change happens. Not through one hero, but through many ordinary people making extraordinary choices." Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Thomas looked out at the city lights and thought about all the prisons across America, all the correctional officers facing ethical dilemmas, all the inmates hoping someone would stand up for them. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. There would always be another Marcus Reynolds, another corrupt official, another blind spot in the system where predators operated. But there would also be more David Chens, people who survived and chose to help others, more Sarah Mitchells, leaders who prioritized reform over reputation. More Emma Wrights, young people inspired to enter corrections with idealism and determination. The prison bully had thought the cameras were off. He'd thought no one was watching, that he was invisible and untouchable. He'd been wrong. Someone had been watching all along, and because of that, everything changed. This is a story about courage, not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the quiet, daily courage of noticing what's wrong and refusing to look away. It's about Thomas Wright, who risked his career and his family's safety because he couldn't ignore a victim's suffering. It's about David Chen and 23 others who found the strength to speak truth about their trauma. It's about Sarah Mitchell and other leaders who chose to transform broken systems rather than defend them. But more than anything, it's a reminder that change is possible, that one person's decision to act can cascade into institutional transformation, that justice, though often delayed and imperfect, can eventually prevail. Marcus Reynolds built an empire in the shadows, believing he was untouchable. He underestimated the power of one person who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable, and in the end, that was his downfall. If this story inspired you, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who need to hear this message. Stories like these matter. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you powerful narratives about courage, justice, and transformation. Thank you for watching. And remember, someone is always watching. Make sure you're proud of what they see. The end.